And welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Nicolas Moyer. He is the CEO of CUSO International. Nicholas, we were talking about some of the changes in foreign aid funding that are happening, US, AID, and others as well. So, how are you pivoting? We kind of started to talk about that a little bit in the previous segment, but obviously less money around. Is there a skill set that CUSO has that can be helpful in this regard, or tell us what you're doing?
Well, I think very much so. International development assistance does very many things. And in fact, sometimes it's too broad a label. It supports health, it supports education, it supports access to employment. And that is really where we spend a lot of our time and effort is helping communities really lift themselves up through skills and capacity. And so we work a lot with the private sector, which is, I think, one of the critical things that we need to be doing as a international development community is to really figure out how we can work more closely with both the private sector and I'd say governments in being part of the solution to help communities address their problems. These cuts to USAID are really profound and they're having big impacts right across the world. I admit, very concerned, and I think many are, about the impacts this is having on, supporting things like maternal and newborn child health and impacts on under five mortality around the world and funding that was for those things that is no longer available. Humanitarian relief, and really I think that is going to have a big impact on disaster response capacity around the world when disasters do come. I think there's a lot of things to be concerned about, but and that have been talked about in the news. But some of the things that haven't been talked about perhaps as much are the total cuts to funding that support good governance or that support human rights and law and order initiatives in other countries. And there's really, I think, a lot that comes from stability that we can provide in other parts of the world that we perhaps sometimes take for granted. And so, in the face of these cuts, we're going to be really watching how it is that we can best support our
Mm.
partners. Obviously, it's hard to fill the gap when the US has cut such a significant amount of development assistance.
So, I guess this comes down to because there's a public policy component to this, and there's also a public opinion component to this, and it's kind of tough. Let's be honest with ourselves here. It is
Mhm.
tough for the international aid community to say to the taxpayer, the voter, "Hey, I know you're suffering or hurting, but what we do is important too." So, how do you, first of all, how do you respond to that?
I think that's a really good question. And I think it's something our sector needs to grapple with because I would argue that in the international development circles, there's been perhaps a little bit too much of a use of kind of high principles and values and engaging with people. And we need to really remind ourselves that it's about the impact we want to have in the world and really lifting people up out of poverty and the big difference that we can make. And the truth is, Canadians can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can help our most vulnerable, and we can have a space program. We can do things to help people in Canada, and we can help people internationally. As a country that really depends on the world doing well, we have a good reason to invest in that, and we can do that for good and moral reasons. We can also do that for good national interest reasons. And you could talk to, senior leaders in military institutions, and they'll tell you that global security is not just a question of military strength. It really does require civil elements, and that's an important contribution that international development does make to our global order. And so Canada needs to be present on the world stage. But I think that's where we could start asking ourselves some question.
Mm.
We have had real impact with our international assistance over the years, but are we getting the best impact that we could today? Are we both doing good and doing good for Canada?
Hmm. And how do you measure success? Because further to your just made point, if you
Mhm.
can show the government, business leaders, the public that a dollar invested in international assistance actually does help. How do you measure that?
I think that's one of the big things that we need to solve for. And in fact, there was an Auditor General report in 2023 that showed that Global Affairs Canada could do better in terms of demonstrating the impact of our Canadian development assistance. And I think that needs to be prominent in decisions that are made and ways to approach this. There are a few really important things here. One, on the public health side, it's hard to measure a life saved. It
Mm.
is, however, really valuable to note the massive progress that there has been in access to global education, on primary school education around the globe in the last 20 years. The reduction of under five mortality rates in that same period of time. The impact that vaccination campaigns have had on addressing um, um, diseases that we have solutions for. Simultaneously, there are economic indicators we can look at. I don't know if we often enough talk about this, but
Mm,
South Korea was a major recipient of Canadian aid for the decades that followed the Korean War.
mhm.
It's now the 11th largest economy in the world. We have a free trade agreement with them, and we
Sure.
trade more. We've trade more with South Korea than we ever gave them in aid every year.
We're going to just take another brief break, Nicholas. It's an important point. We'll get back to it after these messages.